hello.
Shad, it's great to be here with you.
Thanks for coming in. So what reaction do you usually get when you tell people that you report on drug cartels for a living?
They think I'm some big, brave, courageous. Sometimes if you ask my mother, she thinks I'm crazy and I've lost my sense of self, that I'm just, I don't know what's important in life.
She still thinks that. You've been doing this for a while.
She thinks that. Well, I actually kept that from my mother for many, many years. I went to Mexico as a young reporter, convinced that I could tell the other side of the story, the other Mexico, the Mexico of possibility, the beautiful Mexico that many Canadians know, and try not to get too much into the other piece. There's a saying in Mexico, "Quieres tapar el sol con un dedo." You want to cover the sun with the finger, and that was my intention, was to try to look the other way. I was raised on the U.S.-Mexico border, so we had seen that story. We had heard about that story, and I thought that maybe there was another Mexico that we should write more about. And for the longest time, when I went to Mexico, I promised my parents that I would never cover drug traffickers, especially my father, who always would remind me that drug traffickers do not know the meaning of the word perdón, forgiveness. So I made that promise, and I was very good about keeping that promise. I wanted to look at other aspects of Mexico: the culture, the music, the food, immigration. I was very interested in U.S. policy to Mexico, etc. But then we had a political change in 2000. You had the first opposition government take over, rule in Mexico. And suddenly there was a power vacuum that was created, that emerged throughout the country. And the power went to the states. And I think that's sort of when the drug traffickers, who for the longest time were sort of kept. I mean, they were kept by the government. They were checked by the government. Suddenly they became bad boys, wild boys, and they went crazy. And we have the mayhem that we see today. Almost more than 120,000 people killed or disappeared. Some figures have it as even higher than that. So it's a story that I reluctantly cover, but I think we have to cover.
And is that the main reason why you wanted to take on that story, was because it just kind of grew in terms of its importance and its impact on the country?
I always wanted to know why we left Mexico as a kid. I mean, I left at the age of 6, and my mother felt like we had to come to the United States for a better life, for a better opportunity. And I was always curious as to why, the why. Is it a question of opportunity, non-opportunity? A question of us versus them. I mean, we grew up impoverished, but lucky for us, my father was part of a program that's very similar to one in Canada. It was a guest worker program where my father would go to the United States for a certain amount of months and then would come back. And so we were kind of the lucky ones. We lived in poverty, but my father would consistently send money back home, and we would see him once a year. So I didn't understand the sense of poverty until, ironically, we moved to the United States, and suddenly we were migrant workers living in a trailer house. And I think that experience always wanted me to someday grow up and prove to my parents that Mexico was not as bad as they made it sound, out to be. And so when I was as a young man, as a teenager, I always dreamed of the day I could go back to Mexico and sort of recapture my roots, recapture my culture, my language, etc. And the opportunity came, when a college professor said that you can go back to Mexico and maybe be a foreign correspondent and earn American dollars. I thought, this is what I want to do.
I read a great story about you first encountering the career of journalism, period, when you were a young child. You were maybe 13?
Oh, yeah, I was 13. I was working out in the fields in California, Central Valley. It's the San Joaquin Valley. And there was this rule at the time in California that you could not be under 15 to have to work a full day. So my mother would always put these, a big hat, a big shirt on so that I could try to look older. and there was a TV crew that came up to me, and they were doing a story about underage children in the fields and working conditions. They looked at me, and they probably thought this kid is not, he's not 15, you know. So they came up to me and asked me all these questions, and I was very honest. The first question was, "How old are you?" I said 13. So right away they knew that I was the subject for the story. And that's, yeah, I mean, my parents were terrified about that, you know, that I was now, had caused trouble for them, and that maybe we would be deported back to Mexico, or that maybe Cesar Chavez, who at the time was the union leader um, for the UFW, was going to get mad at us and would kick us out of the union. But for me, it left a sense of empowerment, that someone actually cared about my story, that someone wanted to give me a voice. And I think that always kind of stayed in my mind. You know, what would it be like to be a reporter? Although I really wanted to be a songwriter at the time, but I thought, you know, reporting was such a cool job.
Would your father have preferred you were a songwriter to a journalist?
I think both of them, especially my mother. My mother used to sing as a young woman in Durango, back in Mexico, northern Mexico, and she was always so happy whenever I would come home and I would write a song. And in fact, later on in life, I realized that she hid all my songs because she thought someday I would see the light and I would come back and be a songwriter.
But journalism captured you more than
journalism captured me. I mean, just the idea of going back to Mexico and sort of being part of a movement at the time. We're talking about the 1980s, when there was a citizen movement growing in northern Mexico, in the state of Chihuahua. That was exciting. That was exciting to be an American journalist, to cover these stories, to see a population grow and learn to hold government accountable. I think that was really my motivation when I first started dabbling across the border and covering these stories.
I'm curious about this idea of wanting to investigate your roots and investigating why your family migrated, because migration is such a complicated thing. How do the drugs cartels factor into that migration for you?
I mean, again, as young people, I think, especially on the U.S.-Mexico border, you always knew that there was a huge demand in the United States. You always knew that Mexicans were coming in and bringing drugs to, you know, I guess take care of the need of the demand on this side of the border, on the U.S. side of the border, and the Canadian side of the border. So it was almost like a fact of life. You didn't really question it. You didn't really, you weren't really that curious about it because, you know, at the time we had a small little restaurant in El Paso, and next door you had some shady businesses that were going on, and you saw people who were taking used clothes up to L.A. or bringing clothes from L.A. to the border, but there was something else they were carrying. You know, I mean, people were working overnight and stuffing bags and so forth.
You just didn't ask questions.
You didn't ask questions because that was part of life. You know, you were respectful. I think, again, that all changed after the opposition government came into office. I was a reporter covering everything but drug trafficking. I mean, I sort of kept that promise to my parents. I think what changed things around was an opposition government coming in, and you see a power vacuum. But more importantly, you had the emergence of a paramilitary group known as the Zetas. And the Zetas, I think, changed the dynamics of drug trafficking in Mexico. I mean, some of them were trained by U.S. special elite forces with the intention of going back to Mexico, becoming part of a of a special unit to take on drug traffickers. They were co-opted. They were basically bought off by another cartel, a rival cartel in Mexico, and said, you know, how much money are you getting paid? And so. I said, well, we'll double it, we'll triple it. Come work for us. And they became sort of bodyguards, special bodyguards for a cartel named the Golf Cartel. Eventually, not very surprising, they formed their own group, the Zetas paramilitary group, and they brought on this overwhelming violence to Mexico. I mean, what the song talks about, you know, decapitated heads and so forth. I mean, that's really what became their mode of operation. Terrifying communities, taking over communities, the mayor's office, the police departments, threatening journalists, taking over journalism rooms, etc. I mean, they literally control communities from ground up. And that was a change because I think in the old days, drug cartels were trying not to be invisible, but trying to do their business. And that they had to discipline people, or that's a nice word, I mean, basically kill people, they would do it in a very quiet way. You know, business is business. There was always a government corruption, co-option that was taking place. But the government sort of stayed on the side. You know, they were the referees, if you will. When the Zetas come in, the Zetas own the game. It was their game.
And that's when you knew you had to get involved with telling this story. That's when something changed for you.
I don't know that I knew I had to get involved, but I knew that this was a different story. And I think it began to really provide clues to why there's so much, in part, why there's so much immigration, why there's so much despair in Mexico. And that's because the institutions are basically beholden, hostage to criminal groups.
I'm talking to author and journalist Alfredo Corchado, who writes about drug cartels in Mexico. So what you do is obviously very risky work. What precautions do you take when you head out on a story?
We at the beginning, when the death threats came in, when we knew this was not just an average story, my paper, the Dallas Morning News, our company, Bilo at the time, they were sending in security consultants. They were getting us to talk to consultants from Dallas, from Mexico City. At one point, they spent something like $20,000 to change the windows, bulletproof windows outside. They sent us to the U.S., to Washington, to get some special training. When I say they, I'm talking about my colleague and my significant other, Angela Cocherga, who's a TV reporter. So we were both doing this, you know, trying to find ways to keep safe. At one point, they were talking about sending an armored car from San Antonio so that we could drive around. They had a special detail team that was following us. They gave us a red phone and said, you know, anytime you feel like you're in danger, press that red phone, and within minutes, somebody will show up. In the end, I think Angela, as well as myself, I mean, we felt more in danger with that kind of attention. They even advised us that maybe we should be armed, you know, carry a gun. But I think the more that happens, the more attention you will generate. In the end, I hate to say this, and it's something that's always debatable. I believe that I am safe. I believe that I am alive because I'm a U.S. citizen, and because there are consequences. Many of my colleagues, more than 100 journalists, have been killed in just over 10 years. Not one case has been solved. So you can kill a journalist every 26 hours. A journalist is assaulted in Mexico. That's according to Periodistas de Pie, a grassroots organization. There are no consequences for people who kill a journalist or for people who just kill in general in Mexico. I mean, the impunity, the level of impunity is so high. Less than 5% of cases are solved.
But you can flash your U.S. passport.
I go out to the field, and I always make sure that I have my credential that's outside showing. Obviously, I'm Mexican. I look Mexican. I make sure that my passport is in my pocket and that you see the U.S. part outside, or just the word passport. I make sure that people know that I'm a U.S. citizen and that there are consequences. That if you do something, I want to believe that a society, whether it's the international community or the United States or the U.S. government, will do something about that.
How do you prepare yourself mentally for some of the things that you're going to see out there?
You know, it's difficult. I mean, because oftentimes you don't know what you're going to see. I think more than anything, it shakes your faith. You know, I'm a pretty hopeful person, but I think what we've seen in the last 10 years or so is something that makes you question. You know, are we from the same species? I mean, how can one human being do this to another person? It's not just what you see, but also what you hear. And when you talk to victims, I think that also shakes you. I mean, If you see a dead body, you see a dead body, and yeah, it stays with you. But it's really when you talk to the victims that it becomes that much more real to you.
Is that a question that moves you as a journalist? Like, how do people do this to each other?
Well, yeah, absolutely. How do people do this to each other, and how do people survive? I mean, how do the victims survive? How do the victims? Because I mean, I think the hope in Mexico is really the people themselves, the people who are learning to hold government accountable. And sadly, many of those people are victims of crime. People who are learning to kind of to stand up and to cross the lines. I mean, the economic lines. Whether it's the rich, whether it's the poor, they're trying to build community. That's I think.
Build community and hold the government to account?
Exactly, exactly. I mean, and that's really where the hope in Mexico lies.
Do you remember the first time you ever received a death threat?
It was covering in El Paso, Texas. I mean, I was working for the El Paso Herald Post. You would hear, I mean, if you cover Juarez at the time, I mean, it was always, people always say they're going to threaten you. But it was always, that's part of the job, don't worry about it. The death threat I got in July 2007 is something I'll never forget. I mean, it shook me.
There was something different about it?
It was something different because it was delivered by a trusted U.S. source. Because I had become too involved, some people would say maybe even obsessed with the Zetas. We discovered through our investigations that the Zetas had operations in North Texas, in the Dallas area, that was really their home of operations for the United States. And as a reporter, you think, wow, this is the big story. So you start covering it without really measuring the consequences because, again, you're a U.S. journalist. But I think when the call came in from the U.S. Investigator, that just, I mean, I could feel just the floor shaking. I thought, this is it. And that's something I will never forget.
What did you do?
I stood there. I had just won a big prize, journalism prize. We were getting ready to go to a party with other colleagues. Angela was there and had another friend there. And I stood in my bedroom with the phone. I dropped the phone. I walked out from the room. They looked at me and said, what's wrong? And I said, there's a threat against an American journalist. 3 names came up. My source thinks it's me. The first thing you want to do, I think any normal person would do, is leave the country. And I called my editor and says, get on the next flight. But I really felt that this was so serious that where do you run to? Do you run to the U.S. side? Do you run to Mexico? I felt that I wanted to stay to check the validity of the threat, reach out to sources, both in the government, both in the underground world, and try to maybe reach out to whoever was delivering the threat. And what happens next is really the basis of the book.
You're obviously very dedicated, but moments like that probably make you want to leave working in Mexico.
I thought of that.
What would it take for you to leave?
That's a great question. I don't know that I would go through that again. As I said at the beginning, I kept that from my parents. I kept all those stories from my parents. I didn't want them to spend the night worrying about me or praying to the Virgin of Guadalupe. Now that they know the full story, because it's out in the book in Spanish and English, and my parents read it in Spanish, I don't know that I would put them through the same journey. It's just not. It's not worth it. As much as I think. I mean, I think 2 things. One is we should not define a country or society just by violence, but by people. And so I'm always trying to also give the other side of the story of Mexico. There's a more prosperous side that many Americans, many Canadians see in Mexico, Central Mexico. Automotive industry. You have a lot of Canadians going to Nuevo León. That's another story I think we have a responsibility to write. But the other story that drives me is a sense that if you're if you have more protection as a reporter, you have to tell these stories. Otherwise, these lives, the people disappear will be forgotten. I mean, I'm always amazed when I leave Mexico and I tell people these many people have died. It doesn't really register
when you throw out the statistics, but when you can tell the actual story.
Right.
Yeah. Now, you quote your uncle as saying that Mexico isn't cursed by history, but by betrayal. Do you agree?
No, I don't. I mean, a lot of things that I wanted to prove my mother wrong and my uncle wrong. My uncle felt that, by that I mean the context of that was that he felt too many people left Mexico. Too many people saw the United States as the escape valve, and so they would leave. And he was one of these people who felt that the future was in Mexico, that we had to do something about it. I don't know that. I mean, I know that we didn't betray Mexico. Oftentimes during that death threat, I really felt like Mexico had betrayed me.
Mm. Thanks so much for your time, Alfredo. This is fascinating. I hope people can see you tonight with the Illuminato Festival.
My pleasure, Shad. Thank you very much.